the only theory of truth that there is. There is also a long tradition known as the coherence theory of truth. And the coherence theory of truth isn't interested in whether what we have in our heads corresponds with what's out there. It doesn't even make that separation. And it's not interested particularly in what there is. What it's interested in is how should we live together in a harmonious way. And then a coherence theory of truth moves much more towards harmony, towards convergence, towards resonating with other people and being in harmony with them, not towards this black and white objectivity. And I think if you think about truth within or objectivity within a coherence theory of truth rather than the correspondence theory of truth, then you get out of a lot of the problems that we run up against when we start debating, well, is there objectivity or isn't there? Because the key question becomes, ultimately, how are we going to live together in a more peaceful and harmonious way? And that I think changes everything without necessarily, if you think of harmony and the ultimate convergence, doing away with the notion of, well, yes, not everything is subjective. That would be my way of sort of getting out of this subjective, objective.
I think that works. And one of the things we talked about in the first show is the need to, any business that forms sits down and comes up with a business goal or set of goals and objectives on how to achieve those. And what we were trying to touch upon in the first show is that as a species, humanity has not done that. And I think that would be a valuable exercise to have a group of people sit down and say, okay, number one, we'd like to be able to hang around here for a little longer than we're going to hang around if we continue on our current path of cutting down all the forests, including the groundwater and including the oceans, including the air. So if you have a set of objectives that are not based on this, I like calling it nepotistic capitalism, basically where there's a cronyism, that there's a certain group of people that happen to own the trees or think they own the trees and own the oil, and they're calling the shots on, what kind of programs, what kind of energy programs we have, and they're based on their own special interests are deciding basically on the zeitgeist for the age, and it tends to be tied in with a particular model of the governed and the governed and that sort of thing, and
the elite.
The elite, right? Yeah. And it's and that's what's this war is. I characterize this war that's going on, and it may not be a popular position since George Bush has 90% approval rating, which I always find shocking and very indicative of the country we live in. It's a war really between the forces of fascism and the forces of terrorism, and there's a whole nother side here, which is the forces of utopia. So those two sides, fascism and terrorism, are the Fustellian. That's the warlike, the patriarchal, this, hey, we're going to do this, do it our way, rather than the utopian model, which is like, hey, I just want to be free. I want to live my life. I don't need, just leave me alone. We'll live in tribes. We'll do whatever we want. If we need something, we'll create it or we'll buy it. And the model that I've been promoting for a few years is social capitalism. So I don't want to get rid of capitalism. I studied business, and the market, that invisible hand, works. It works. But the problem with capitalism is that it doesn't include the social costs of capitalism. So when you manufacture something, you don't assume that the tree is free. You don't assume that the tree, when it's gone, there's some opportunity costs, like the animals that lived around there and the topsoil erosion that it prevents and all that stuff. And somebody actually sat down and they put a value on what nature, the gross national product that nature gives us. If we didn't have nature pollinating the plants and all this, and it was greater than the domestic gross product of all the countries in the world combined by several orders of magnitude. So if we have a model where
people have done that, haven't they? They've created a new model of the GNP that's based on
right,
sustainability.
Sure, yeah.
And also you've got to figure in other costs, like the cost of domestic servants, incling the people half the population.
Right. Yeah, Galbraith and the whole thing, the crypto servants, and that whole thing, you have to include that as well.
Well, there's no question we could devise a better economic system, but how are you going to get there?
Well, that's the big, that's the ultimate question.
First, this one is going to crash. It's just sort of a matter of time, and then out of the ashes, maybe we'll have an opportunity.
Yeah. But it's going to not be a very pretty thing.
No, it's not going to be.
Awful.
It's those post-apocalyptic movies you've seen, Mad Max and The Postman, and some of these.
They're probably utopian.
Yeah, that's
Right,
utopia.
compared to
exactly.
how it's going to be.
And
Well,
no
that's
more
why I'm
cable
trying to
access
go out in the
shows.
woods and grow my own food.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a real value to being able to grow your own food, have your own water supply, and be away from the maddening masses, basically, food riots and that
Germs.
sort of thing.
So,
Germs. yeah.
Alicia, can I ask you this? I'm not trying to push you into a box here, but are you, and how do you stand in relation to modernity? Are you, in a sense, rejecting modernity?
Not at all. We're
No?
combining
Okay.
the best
Yeah,
aspects of
okay.
modernity with
Right,
the best
exactly.
aspects of ancient tribalism.
Right.
Okay, so
Shamanism.
you're integrating.
Yeah.
Right. She's
Uh-huh.
into
No reason
integration.
to throw the baby away with the
No,
bathwater. That's
no.
what I would say.
Right. Exactly.
Galen, when you use the term utopian, traditionally as that term is understood, utopian is a linear conception.
How do you?
Well, I mean that in other words, that one progresses towards it.
Oh, right.
Do you accept that linear interpretation, or is it perhaps cyclical? In other words,
Yeah.
behind this question
Right.
is, are we evolving? Are things getting better, or do we spiral around? And is there a possibility that we can actually, sort of have retrograde motion?
No, I actually think that we're in the Kali Yuga. We're in the worst times, and we had a
Yeah.
golden age, after the Ice Age, where there was pretty much hunter-gatherer. There's plenty. It wasn't matriarchal. It wasn't patriarchal. It was pretty much based in balance. There was balance between male and female, and then the men started to take over. And
This is such nonsense. I just have to say that.
why do you say that?
It's such a Wilbur calls a pre-trans fallacy. There was no golden age, brother. Get with it. Things
Well,
are better than they've been, and they're really messed up, and we can blow the whole paradigm and the whole planet right here, right now. But things have been really harsh for human beings ever since we were around.
How do you know?
Yeah, how do you know?
History? I
As
mean, I
Wilbur
look at
says
what I
it.
know and what I read.
We're talking about prehistory. though.
Prehistory. We're talking about prehistory.
Oh, I think you
Nobody
guys are
knows
going
much
into
about
this
Nobody
history,
knows.
whole
You don't know what happened
feminized
in
retro
prehistory.
history.
But
That's
the
basic.
myth.
There's a myth.
None
There's
of
a
us
myth.
know.
There's a myth. There's
None
a
of
myth
us
of a
know.
gold time. Anyway, to go back to this issue, I think that there are periods of retrograde. Now people think that just because there's a great movie called Time Bandits with this little kid. It's a Terry Gilliam movie, and this little kid was fascinated with the past, and he was all excited. He was reading about. He said, "Dad, the ancient Greeks knew 50 ways to kill a man," and his dad said rather casually, "He's like, well, at least I've got a 7-speed hedge trimmer." And that's kind of the mentality
progress.
people have, is because we have these conveniences that somehow they feel that our mental life is as good as it's ever been. I'd argue just the opposite. I think the average person in this country has a much lower level of mental life
Well, it depends
than the
on
average person
what
even
mental
in
life
India.
that you're talking about.
Are you
because
meaning
I think-
emotional and spiritual, or you really mean mental?
I mean just awareness. Okay, I'll say that the average person in this country is pretty apathetic. They're very materialistic, and there's a certain veneer of what's that this material
Well, there's a
stuff
lack
is
of
important.
meaning.
There's a lack of meaning.
Of deep meaning.
There's a lack of substance.
But many people like Rudolf Steiner, there's a theory that at this point we're all call it evolving or devolving, but there's a push toward evolving more of the left brain and the mental side, which is a necessary stage to develop free will, whereas perhaps there's a theory that the ancients, and many people disagree with this, but that the ancients had more of a direct relationship with the gods, and so they didn't have as much free will because it was more like they were receiving messages, or they were more in touch with their intuitive side, whereas there's been this need, and that's why sort of religion developed into science, to develop our objective side so that we could come back around to the level of spirit, but from
Right,
the
but
perspective of free will.
Right, exactly. I think that's part of the design of nature, is to do that. I mean, when you realize that if you transcend, going to that mythical fifth dimension, you transcend causality. And so I think you could argue that. It may or may not be true, but if you go, imagine, if you're on it's the flat world.
Because
If you're
causality implies
three-dimensional,
time.
yeah, because causality implies time. And so if you step into whatever the fifth dimension might be, I would say it could be consciousness. That is the fifth dimension that goes, as a wrapper around space and time. And that there's an inevitability that we must develop the science, because I think somehow the science we create DNA somehow. It's like the Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, where there's a certain inevitability, and things have to be this way because of the nature of beingness. We're bound to develop with science an understanding of the genome, an understanding of DNA, so that we can actually create it, and that is what is required because it's unstuck in time, and that going back and wrapping around on itself is what's needed for it to happen at all. So it's that kind of magical. I don't know if I'm describing it well. It's something that doesn't lend itself to words. It's Hinduism, and that spark is it goes around and around and around, and all of a sudden it comes back and creates what the original.
Snake eating its tail.
Right, snake eating its tail, exactly. Jordan, you look perplexed.
No, I'm not perplexed. I'm still.
You're still. I say I'm full
No,
of
it
shit.
seems to me that
Somebody
you
said that.
that you kind of like to compare to the people who you think existed 300 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. That you keep forgetting that there was only a very small percentage of the population back then that had
I'm saying
hardly
more than
any
3,000.
freedom.
I'm saying much more than 3,000 years ago. I'm talking about after the last ice age. So I'm talking more like 15,000 years ago,
Right.
when the land was fecund and there was plenty of, there was plenty to go around. There weren't that many people, and the only thing you had to worry about is not.
Right, they may have
sharing
had
the cave with
an easier, simpler life, and you look like people like Csikszentmihalyi, and they talk about, well, everybody spends about the same amount of time going for food and sleeping and playing. Yeah, they may have had a much lower stress lives than any of us have right now. But you're comparing apples and oranges, and you're kind of picking a piece of their interior lives and extolling it. And certainly they had mystical states and awarenesses, and some of them were very high beings. But I'm not sure what you gain by